This tape is about the Winawer variation of the French defence. The Winawer arises after the opening moves 1 e4 e6, 2 d4 d5, 3 knight c3 bishop b4. This is one of the most popular ways of playing the French. The Winawer is an aggressive opening with black aiming for more than half a point. The pin on the white knight forces white to come to a decision in the centre because now his king's pawn is undefended. Although the opening is attributed to Winawer, it was first developed into a system by the great Dane Nimzowitsch. In fact, on the continent it's called the Nimzowitsch variation. In reply to 3 bishop b4, white usually advances in the centre with 4 e5. Although other moves are possible, such as 4 knight ge2. After 4 e5, black has a choice between c5, undermining the white centre, or the more modern plan with b6, planning to exchange the white squared bishops. On this tape, I'm going to look at complete Grandmaster games in order to show the potential of this opening. I won't give reams of variations, a specialist book on the opening will do this. Instead, I will concentrate on the strategic ideas behind the opening. The first game we will look at is a game between Ivanovic White and Vaganian Black. This was played in a tournament at Nixich in 1978. After 1 e4 e6, 2 d4 d5, 3 knight c3 bishop b4, Ivanovic advanced 4 e5. Now Vaganian played 4 c5. 4 c5 aims to destroy white's pawn centre, and then black can form a pawn centre himself. The drawback of the Winawer is that black is weakened on the king's side, and if he exchanges the black squared bishop for white's queen knight, then he would be weak on the black squares. Bobby Fischer thought that the Winawer was positionally unsound because of these drawbacks, but the present world champion Karpov doesn't think the same way and always avoids the Winawer by playing 3 knight d2, the Tarrasch French. White can try to take advantage of the absence of black's dark squared bishop from the king's side by playing queen g4 at various stages. This move, queen g4, we will look at later on in the tape. There are 2 games in the match, Spassky vs Korchnoi, Belgrade 1978, which were critical for this move, queen g4. Anyway, back to Ivanovic Vaganian. White now played 5a3. Vaganian captured the white knight, 5 bishop takes c3 check. Black could have retreated the bishop to a5, but experience has shown that white can get the advantage after bishop a5 by an immediate queen g4. An illustrative game with 5 bishop a5 is given in the booklet. Meanwhile, back to our game. Vaganian played 5 bishop takes c3 check, and Ivanovic recaptured 6 b takes c3. Now Vaganian played 6 knight e7. Knight e7 is normally played here so that black has the option of sacrificing his king's knight pawn if white plays queen g4. This is preferable to having to play g6 in reply to queen g4. If black ever plays g6, he's very weak on the f6 and h6 squares, having no black squared bishop to defend them. So 6 knight e7 is regarded as black's best choice here. Now white has a choice of two moves on move 7. He can either play 7 knight f3 or 7 queen g4. 7 queen g4 is critical, and as I've mentioned, there are two games later on this tape, Spassky-Korchnoi games, which will feature 7 queen g4. But in this game, Ivanovic chose 7 knight f3. After 7 knight f3, black has an important decision to make on how to develop his queenside pieces. So switch off the tape and think what you would do in this position. Well, what did you decide on? Was it 7 bishop d7, 7 knight bc6, 7 queen a5, or 7 queen c7? 7 queen a5 immediately puts pressure on white by threatening the front c pawn. 7 bishop d7, however, has the idea of posting the queen bishop on a4, where it would be very awkward for white, attacking the backward c pawn and blockading the white a pawn. Often in the Winaver, white likes to play a4 followed by bishop a3 when the white bishop is well placed. But 7 bishop d7 leaves the black b pawn temporarily undefended, and white can play to take advantage of this. For instance, in the 10th game of the Spassky-Korchnoi candidates match, Korchnoi chose 7 bishop d7, and Spassky continued 8 d takes c5, queen c7, 9 bishop d3, bishop a4, 10 rook b1 exclamation mark. Now white has the advantage. Because of the weakness of the b pawn, Spassky was able to transfer his queen's rook to the king's side via b4, attacking the black bishop on a4 on the way. Notice that it is very bad for black to exchange his b pawn for white's c pawns, since white then has the advantage of the two bishops and a rook on the 7th rank. Returning to diagram 1, 7 knight bc6 is a good move, but does not put as much pressure on white's position as 7 queen a5. 7 queen c7 is also a playable alternative, but again the same comment applies to 7 knight bc6. White does not have many worries over his development. I've just been told by Mike Basman that instead of Vaganyan, as I've been saying, it should be Vahanyan in Armenian. Vahanyan chose 7 queen a5, the move giving white the least number of alternatives. Because of the attack on the front c pawn, white now has to choose between 8 queen d2 or 8 bishop d2. Ivanovic played 8 queen d2, still hoping to play a4 followed by bishop a3. The alternative move 8 bishop d2 will be featured in the next game on the tape, Bern against Korchnoi. But this game features 8 queen d2. Vahanyan now played 8 knight bc6, simply developing his queen's knight. Now white played 9 bishop d3. Switch off the tape and think what you would play for black in this position. Vahanyan played the interesting move 9 b6, planning to exchange the white squared bishops. This is a common theme in the Winaver, and here it works very well. The exchange of white squared bishops not only enables black to infiltrate his pieces on the white squares, but also reduces white's attacking threats on the king side. Ivanovic now played 10a4, and Vahanyan continued his plan with 10 bishop a6. Now white played 11 d takes c5. Switch off the tape and see what you would play as black now. Vahanyan now captured the bishop by 11 bishop takes d3, which Ivanovic must have underestimated. The simple 11 d takes c5 allows white to equalize by 12 bishop takes a6, queen takes a6, 13 bishop a3, when the black queen has to go back to a5. By capturing first on d3, Vahanyan keeps his queen on the good square a5. White's 11th move, d takes c5, was in fact a mistake, and he should have captured on a6 first. Back to the game. After Vahanyan captured the bishop with 11 bishop takes d3, Ivanovic recaptured with the queen, 12 queen takes d3. Vahanyan recaptured 12 b takes c5. Now white castled, 13 castles kingside, and black played 13 c4. This move gains space and fixes the white c-pawns. It also slightly embarrasses white's queen. Ivanovic now played 14 queen d2, and Vahanyan castled kingside, 14 castles kingside. Notice how sterile white's position is. The absence of white squared bishops makes an attack on the king's side very difficult, and white is tied down to his weaknesses on the queen side. White now played 15 bishop a3, and Vahanyan unpinned his knight by 15 rook fe8. After White's next move, 16 bishop b4, Vahanyan had to decide what to do about the attack on his queen. So switch off and decide where would you put the queen. Vahanyan retreated the queen right back to d8. 16 queen d8. It would have been an error to play 16 knight takes b4, since White is then rid of his doubled c-pawns. Now White decided to take the knight on e7, rather than let it come to g6, attacking the white e-pawn. After White's 17th move, 17 bishop takes e7, Vahanyan recaptured with the queen. 17 queen takes e7. White played 18 rook a e1. Now Vahanyan played a good move. He played 18 f5. If White doesn't capture en passant, the king side is completely blocked and White has no chance of attacking there. This would be disastrous for White because in the long run he would lose the weak pawns on the queen side. So White has no real choice in the matter. He must take en passant, which he did. 19 e takes f6. Black recaptured with the queen. 19 queen takes f6. Now let's have a look at this position after Black's 19th move. This is an ideal position for Black from the Winaver. White's pawn centre has been liquidated. He's lost his d-pawn and e-pawn. They've been exchanged off. And he still has the weak doubled c-pawns. Now White has the problem of how to stop Black's e and d pawns advancing and eventually crushing White's position. So Ivanovic played 20 knight d4, hoping to force Black into exchanging knights when he will undouble his pawns and stop the black pawn centre, or hoping that the knight will move to a more passive position. Now switch off the tape and decide what you would do as Black here. This is a critical position in the game, and Vahanyan played the best move. He played 20 e5. This is a difficult move to see, and there is an involved tactical line which Vahanyan had to see before he could safely play this move. White could now play 21 knight b5. Did you see this move threatening knight c7? After 21 knight b5, Black can simply play rook a d8. After 22 knight c7, attacking both the d-pawn and the rook on e8, it seems that Black must lose but he can play 22 rook f8. After 23 knight takes d5, black can attack the pinned knight with 23 queen f7. White must then play 24 rook d1, and now black has the subtle move 24 king h8. He could not win the pinned knight immediately with knight e7, because 25 knight takes e7 would be check, but after king h8, white has no defence to knight e7. Returning to diagram 2, after seeing that 21 knight b5 was tactically unsound, white has no choice but to play 21 knight takes c6. After 21 knight takes c6, Vahanyan recaptured, 21 queen takes c6. Now white's pawns on the queen side are weaker than ever, and white is in great difficulties because of the strength of black's centre pawns. So white now tried to divert attention from the queen side and also break up black's centre by playing 22 f4. Now if black simply advances 22 e4, white can blockade on the d4 square. So Vahanyan played the intermediate move 22 queen c5 check. Ivanovic played 23 king h1, and now black played 23 e4, and now it's no longer possible for white to blockade on the d4 square, and the black e-pawn is very strong now. White obviously must prevent the advance of this passed e-pawn, so he played 24 rook e3. Black played rook a d8. White played 25 f5. Now we can see what white is trying to do. He's trying to use his f-pawn in order to expose the black king, but in doing so, white himself exposes his own king, and later on in the game this is to be his downfall. After 25 f5, Vahanyan played rook d6, preventing the further advance of the pawn. Now, because of his bad position, Ivanovic decided to try a risky move, 26 g4. Vahanyan played 26 d4. White captured, 27 c takes d4, and black recaptured, 27 rook takes d4, 28 queen f2, again threatening to play f6, and Vahanyan stopped this with 28 queen d6, threatening to play rook d2. Now white can't prevent rook d2, So he carried on with his plan. 29 g5. Black played rook d2, and now white made a mistake. He played 30 queen h4, but he should have played 30 queen f4. The reason why he should have tried to exchange queens in this position is that his own king is more exposed, in fact, than black's, and this is very troublesome later on because black can exploit the insecure position of white's king. So 30 queen f4 was a better move. But after 30 queen h4 in the game, Vahanyan played 30 rook d1 exclamation mark. Now we can see the effect of white's weakened king side. White now had to retreat with 31 queen f2, and black piled on the pressure with 31 rook e5. This is another move which needed to be calculated. Now white has a choice. He can either play 32 f6 or the move which he actually played, 32 queen e2. After 32 f6, black can take on g5, 32 rook takes g5, white pushes on, 33 f7 check, black plays king f8, white takes the e-pawn, 34 rook takes e4, and now black has a choice. He can either play 34 queen d5 or 34 queen c6, one of which loses and one of which wins. In fact, 34 queen d5 is an outright blunder because of 35 queen c5 check, a decoy move. Black has to take the queen, queen takes c5, and is immediately mated by rook e8. But instead, on move 34, queen c6 wins. Now white doesn't have the possibility of playing queen c5 check because the rook on g5 is able to capture the queen if it went there. Returning to diagram 3, white played 32 queen e2, and Vahanyan finished the game neatly. He played 32 rook takes f1 check, white recaptured, 33 queen takes f1, and now black played 33 queen d5, and now white must lose material. He cannot defend his f-pawn, so he played 34 f6. Black took the g-pawn, 34 rook takes g5. White played 35 f takes g7. Black took back with the king, 35 king takes g7. White played 36 queen a1 check. Black played king g6. White played queen e1, 37 queen e1. Notice how, because of white's weakening moves on the king side, his queen can never leave the first rank because of queen d1 check, and his rook cannot move because of e3 discovered check. So he's very restricted. After 37 queen e1, Vahanyan played king f6, moving his king to the centre of the board. White played 38 queen f2 check, and Van Halen played king e6. White played 39 queen e1. Notice that White's completely tied down now. He can't move either his queen or rook, and he's just restricted to moving his queen along the back rank. After 39 queen e1, Van played a5. White played 40 h3, giving a square for his king on h2. Van played king d6. White played 41 queen b1. Black played king c7. And notice now that Black's king is very safe on c7, and he can prepare to move his queen. After 41 king c7, White played queen f1, 42 queen f1. Van played rook f5. White played 43 queen g2, and Black played rook f3, and now Black has a winning position after 43 rook f3. White must take 43, 44, rook takes f3, Black recaptures, e takes f3, and now White must start checking. 45 queen g7 check, king c6, 46 queen f6 check, king c5, and now White could play the move 47 c3. This move would be very desirable since it prevents the black king from advancing either to d4 or b4, but in fact this move loses by force. After 47 c3, Black can play 47 f2 check. White plays king h2. Now Black can trade off the queens. 48 queen d6 check. White plays 49 queen takes d6 check, king takes d6, 50 king g2, king e5, 51 king f2, king e4, 52 king e2, h6, 53 h4, h5, and White's run out of pawn moves and must let the black king in. Returning to diagram 4. So White couldn't play 47 c3 and had to continue checking. 47 queen e7 check, king d4, 48 queen f6 check, king e3, 49 king h2. Now Verhanyan played a good move, 49 queen e4. This immediately threatens to swap the queens by queen f4 check, and also prevents a lot of White's possible checks. White now played 50 queen c3 check, and Black played king e2. Now White plays 51 queen b2, and Black played the final move of the game, 51 f2. Now White resigned, because after 52 c3 check, Black has the simple king f3. White has no more checks, and the pawn must queen. This game was a fine example of the Winaver. Notice that Black played fairly simply. He just followed a few basic strategic ideas. First of all, he exchanged the white squared bishops. This left white weak on the white squares and also reduced white's attacking chances on the king side. This is very important in the Winawer. Black shouldn't try to exploit white's doubled c-pawns immediately, because often then white can gain a decisive advantage on the king side. What black should do is first of all neutralize white's possible attack on the king side, and then he can rely on the weakness of white's doubled c-pawns and isolated a-pawn in the later stages of the middle game and the ending. And this game showed black doing this very well. Vahanyan restricted white on the king side by 18 f5. This was a good move. He could have immediately tried to attack the pawns on the queen side, but by playing f5 he put white in a very difficult position. If white didn't take en passant, he could never gain an attack on the king side, and therefore after taking en passant as he was forced, black had another plan to advance in the centre, and this game showed the potential of the Winawer. He can also play in the centre after liquidating white's centre rather than just attack white's pawn weaknesses on the queen side. Returning to diagram 1, we're now going to look at the game Byrne against Korchnoi. After black's 7th move, queen a5, white played 8 bishop d2 rather than 8 queen d2 as in Ivanovich Vahanyan. 8 bishop d2 is not so well thought of theoretically. By playing bishop d2, white gives up all hope of posting the queen's bishop on the a3 to f8 diagonal, where it is very well placed. The advantage of 8 bishop d2 is that he has the possibility of playing c4 with an attack on the black queen. Black has to be aware of this, for if he proceeds incautiously with a move such as b6 with the idea of swapping the white squared bishops, then c4 is very embarrassing for black because his queen is very short of squares. Therefore, if white plays bishop d2, black has to be on the alert every move for this c4 possibility. And Korchnoi knows this, and the move he played is designed to prevent this. He played 8 knight bc6. Now white could play c4, but black can simply play queen to c7. Now the move c4 is clearly not so good, because after white loses or exchanges his d pawn, then the e pawn will be very weak, and therefore c4 in this position isn't very good for white. So Byrne simply played 9 bishop d3. Now this is a provocative move because it tempts black into playing c4, pushing back the bishop. Byrne could have played bishop e2, and obviously c4 isn't very effective against this, but after bishop e2, white has not so many attacking possibilities on the king's side, and black can play to liquidate the white pawn centre by f6, whereas this isn't so easy against bishop d3. So Byrne chose 9 bishop d3, and Korchnoi played 9 c4. Now Byrne played 10 bishop f1. This looks a funny move, putting the bishop back on the original square, but it's very logical. After 10 bishop e2, black can play bishop d7, followed by castles queenside, and f6, or possibly f6 immediately, attacking the white pawn centre. After black plays f6, white normally captures on f6, and black recaptures with g takes f6. Now black has a very weak pawn on e6, and Byrne's move bishop f1 is designed to take advantage of this. White has the possibility of playing g3 followed by bishop h3, and this will put a lot of pressure on black's e-pawn. From diagram 5, after 10 bishop f1, switch off the tape and see what you would play as black here. Korchnoi in fact did play f6, and even though Byrne has played bishop f1 ready to take advantage of it, this is the best move, because otherwise white can follow up with g3 and bishop h3, making f6 very difficult to play. And now is the chance for black to play it, and it frees his game considerably. So 10 f6 is a good move, and is very typical of these positions. Again, black's trying to liquidate the white pawn centre, and then he'll be able to form a pawn centre himself. After 10 f6, Byrne captured, 11e takes f6, black played g takes f6, and now Byrne played 12 knight h4. This is a fairly tricky move. Byrne could have continued with g3 and bishop h3, but he's decided that Korchnoi can defend very simply by playing bishop d7 and knight g6, and then putting a rook on e8, and then Korchnoi will have good chances of advancing in the centre with e5. So Byrne played this move, 12 knight h4. This has the immediate threat of queen h5 check. Now switch off the tape and decide what you would do as black in this position. After you've done so, turn over to side 2. Winaver French, Take 1, Side 2. Returning to the game, Bern against Korchnoi. Now, I left you at the position after 12 knight h4 and asked you to decide what you would play as black. There were two moves for black here, 12 knight g6 and 12 castle kingside. 12 knight g6 looks very logical, challenging the white knight, but in fact it loses. After 12 knight g6, 13 queen h5, knight ce7, white has the rather cheap but very effective 14 bishop takes c4, simply winning a pawn. So Korchnoi did not play this. He played 12 castle kingside, and he's seen that white can't attack him on the king side by queen g4 check, king h8, bishop h6, because of rook h8 or rook f7, both defending against the threatened mate on g7, and now white has to worry about the threat of queen takes c3 check. So 12 castles kingside. Bern now continued with the redeployment of his king's bishop by 13 g3, and he was probably considering bishop h3 and bishop g2 as future moves. Now Korchnoi has to decide on what his plan will be in the game. His kingside is fairly weak. The pawn on h7 isn't very well protected, and he isn't very well developed. So Korchnoi decides he better protect his kingside first of all, and then play on the queen side later on in the game. This is a very important technique which I've mentioned in my summing up of the Ivanovic-Vahanyan game. If black immediately tried to attack on the queen side to take advantage of white's weak pawns there, he'd probably find himself in difficulties on the king side. But Korchnoi is very experienced in positions such as this, and he knows what to do. After 13 g3, he played 13 rook f7, just simply protecting his h-pawn. Now black has the possibility of trading off white's strong knight on h4 by knight g6. Then his rook will be very well placed to defend along the second rank. Now Bern could play 14 bishop h3, but he decides that black will be able to defend his e-pawn in time by playing bishop d7 and rook e8, and his bishop on h3 will then be fairly ineffective. So he decides on another plan. He decides to play bishop g2. Then if Korchnoi continues with his plan of trading off his active knight on h4, after the exchange he can follow up with h4, which he wouldn't be able to do with the bishop on h3, followed by h5, trying to further expose black's king. So he played 14 bishop g2, and Korchnoi played 14 bishop d7. Now white castled, 15 castles kingside, and Korchnoi played the move he's been wanting to play for a long time, 15 knight g6. Now we can see both players fighting quite hard. Obviously, if white retreats the knight to f3, then black will have a very good game by possibly playing e5, advancing his centre, although this is quite risky at present time, or simply massing his pieces in the centre and possibly trying to establish a knight on e4. So Byrne does not like this passive course. He could play queen g4, and this is a possible move, but the queen is not too well placed on g4, and black can simply defend against the threatened knight takes g6 by moving the other knight to e7, knight ce7. After queen g4, knight ce7, white's attack is unlikely to succeed. He only has two pieces attacking black's kingside position, and black can simply transfer all his pieces over to the king side by playing king h8 and rook g8 and queen d8. This will become more and more embarrassing for white, who has less material in this sector of the board. Returning to diagram 6, Byrne continued with the idea that he had for a long time. He played 16 knight takes g6, Korchnoi recaptured, h takes g6, and now Byrne played h4. This was the idea of putting the bishop on g2. He's now threatening the move h5. This will be very unpleasant for black. After the exchange of black's g-pawn, black's king will be almost without any shelter at all, and this is very critical for black. Also, if black pushes on after white plays h5 by g5, then white can break through quickly by playing f4. So Korchnoi has a problem here, but he solved it by playing 17 rook h7. And Korchnoi shows the amazing powers of this rook. Now white cannot force through h5, and Korchnoi can simply defend all his weak points on the king side by playing knight e7 and then transferring the other rook across. And we see that Korchnoi's plan has succeeded because white still has his weaknesses on the queen side, and these will tell in the ending, and white can't break through on the king side. Byrne now played 18 rook e1, and Korchnoi transferred his queen rook across, 18 rook e8. Now Byrne played 19 queen f3, and Korchnoi defended his f6 pawn by king g7, 19 king g7. Now Korchnoi has a clever plan here. Instead of putting his knight on e7, he's going to put his knight on f7. the knight on f7 will prepare, after black plays bishop c6, the advance e5, and also on f7 black can maneuver the knight to d6 and e4 at some point. So Korchnoi plan is very flexible. Byrne now played 20 bishop f4. Korchnoi played knight d8. And now Byrne played a slightly inaccurate move. He played 21 rook e2. Byrne's problem in this position is the fact that his queen rook is tied down to the defense of the a pawn, and he's only playing with a limited number of pieces. In addition, he's tied down to the defense of the c pawn, the pawn on c3. So this ties down possibly a queen and a rook, or possibly two rooks. And a better move, in fact, to leave the queen free was 21 rook e3. And rook e2 is a slight mistake. After 21 rook e2, Korchnoi continued 21 knight f7. And now Byrne decided he had to play 22 rook e3. Notice that Byrne is very short of sensible moves. He can't break through on the king side. Korchnoi's already seen to that, and he's tied down very badly on the queen side, and Korchnoi is simply going to re-maneuver his pieces to force through e5. After knight f7, 22 rook e3, Korchnoi played 22 rook h8. That's rook from h7 to h8. The rook has done its task on h7, preventing the thrust h5, and now it can be used much better on another square. Now Byrne played 23 queen e2, and Korchnoi played a good move now. He played 23 bishop c6. This was the point of the move rook h7 to h8. Now, after rook takes e6, black can simply capture on c3, because the rook on e8 is now protected twice. After rook takes e6, queen takes c3, black has a big advantage because he's threatening the rook on a1 and the pawn on d4. In fact, white loses a pawn by force. So this further ties white down, and black's almost ready to push through with e5. After 23 bishop c6, Byrne played 24 queen d2. Korchnoi now played 24 rook e7. Byrne played 25 rook e2. And Korchnoi played 25 rook h8. And now black is threatening to push through with e5. Now, Byrne wanted to try and create some more play on the king side, and he played 26 g4. A very double-edged move, and possibly in the long run a bad one, but in the immediate situation Byrne had to do something to stop black's mounting pressure in the centre. After 26 g4, Korchnoi played e5, and now Byrne made a mistake. He played 27 bishop g3. He should have captured on e5, 27 d takes e5. After 27 d takes e5, f takes e5. The bishop can retreat to g3, 28 bishop g3. Now the difference from the game is black no longer has the cramping e4 move, because white now has the square d4 available for the queen, and after queen d4 check, white has a good position. So this would have left white still very much in the game. But returning to diagram 7, he played the immediate 27 bishop g3 and Korchnoi advanced e4, 27 e4. Now black has a clear advantage. White's position is getting increasingly more cramped, and eventually black will threaten something like f5 or possibly g5 and f4, when white will simply get mashed on the king side. So after 27 e4, Byrne decided to react immediately with 28 g5, hoping to create a blockade on the black squares against the possible pawn storm on the king side. After 28 g5, Korchnoi took f takes g5, and white recaptured 29 h takes g5. Now Korchnoi redeployed his bishop, bishop d7. Now the bishop was doing good work on c6, but now it's needed on the king side. Now black plays to exchange the white squared bishops, and then he'll be able to infiltrate very easily on the king side white squares. So 29 bishop d7. White played 30 bishop f4. Black played bishop g4. White played 31 rook e3. Now black played queen a6. Notice that Korchnoi is still keeping up this attack on the a3 pawn, which ties white down completely, and he's just preparing to transfer his queen to e6. White played 32 rook g3, and black played queen e6. Now white played 33 queen e3, and black played queen f5. And white is almost running out of moves there. All his pieces on the queen side are protecting each other, but they can't move at all, and Korchnoi simply prepares an attack down the h-file. After 33 queen f5, Byrne panicked a bit and was obviously worried about the transfer of black's pieces, e.g. rook h8 and bishop f3, or possibly just rook h8 to h5, followed by moving the other rook round to the h-file. So he played king f1, hoping to evacuate his king by playing king e1 and king d2. But in fact, a possibly better chance would have been to play bishop h3. This looks bad, swapping off the white squared bishops, but white can follow up with king g2 and then moving his queen's rook across the h-file, neutralizing the pressure. Anyway, back to the game. 34 king f1. Now black played rook h8. White played 35 king e1. Now switch off the tape and decide what you would play for black in this position. Black played 35 bishop f3, the best move of the game. Now white can't capture on f3. After 36 bishop takes f3, e takes f3, 37 queen takes e7, rook h1 check, 38 king d2, queen f4 check, wins for black. Returning to diagram 8, white played 36 king d2, and now black played 38 rook 36 rook h4. Now this is very awkward for white because the bishop on f4 is embarrassed, and now white must play 37 bishop b8, the only square for the bishop. Fortunately now traded the white squared bishops. 37 bishop takes g2, burn recaptured, 38 rook takes g2. Now black played rook h3, and this is very awkward for white. He must now play 39 rook g3. Black took the rook, 39 rook takes g3. White took with the queen, 40 queen takes g3. And now black won a pawn with the simple knight takes g5. Now white moved his king. He played 41 king c1. Notice that black was threatening the very awkward e3 check, followed by knight e4 check, winning the queen. So this move was practically forced. After king c1, Korchnoi played knight f3. White played bishop takes a7. Now black played queen g5 check. Notice the simple way in which Korchnoi plays the position. He doesn't worry about trying to make the white king, but simply plays for the ending because he knows that he'll win in the ending because of the weaknesses in white's position. White still has the doubled c-pawns, and black will simply mop up white's king side easily after the exchange of queens, and he will have no risks. After 42 queen g5 check, white captured, queen takes g5, black recaptured, knight takes g5. White played 44 bishop b8, black played rook f7. Now white played 45 rook b1. Now switch off the tape and try to find black's next move. Korchnoi played 45 e3. Did you find this move? If white now plays 46 f takes e3, black goes rook f1 check, white plays king b2, white takes the rook, black takes the rook, rook takes b1 check, white plays 48 king takes b1, and now black plays knight e4. And although white is in fact material up, he's a pawn up, he's got a lost position. He's unable to stop black simply advancing his passed g-pawn, and also white is very tied down to his weak pawns on the queen side. So after 45 e3, Byrne played the only move, 46 f4. Then Korchnoi played knight e4. Byrne played king b2 in order to prevent e2 winning. And then Korchnoi played g5. Byrne played f takes g5, 48 f takes g5, and Korchnoi played e2, threatening rook f1 winning. Byrne played 49 rook e1, and Korchnoi played rook f2, and in this position white resigned. Black has the threat of playing knight d2 to f3, winning the rook, and white can't prevent this by 50 king c1 because of rook f1 winning immediately, so Byrne resigned in this position. This fine game again shows the potential of the Winawer. After the middle game, Black used the advantages of the opening to gain a winning endgame. The weak white squares after the white squared bishops had been exchanged allowed his knight to go to very good squares on the king side, and white's weak c pawns meant that he had no chance of counterplay on the queen side. And again, it was noticeable how Korchnoi first of all defended his king side rather than attacking the weaknesses on the queen side. He waited until the end game and then exploited white's weaknesses there rather than trying to attack them in the opening or middle game. Now return to diagram 1. Put the knight on f3 back on g1, and we'll look at a different 7th move for white. I commented earlier on the tape about white's possibilities of playing queen g4 at various stages, attacking the black king side. This is the critical line, and it happens on move 7, 7 queen g4. We're going to look at 2 games with this move. Both were played in the candidates' final match, Spassky against Korchnoi, in Belgrade, 1978. These were very important games for theory, and the first game I'm going to look at is the second match game. After 7 queen g4, Korchnoi played the normal move 7 c takes d4. Now, instead of playing c takes d4, Black can defend his g-pawn in various ways. He can play g6, but as I've said before, this leaves Black very weak on f6 and h6. In fact, it's almost catastrophic after bishop g5 and bishop f6. He can play knight g6, but then white has a strong possibility in h4, threatening h5. Black must play h5 himself, and white simply plays the queen back to f3 or g3. He can play the queen back to f3 because after knight takes h4, white can play queen h3 followed by g4. But queen g3, the simple queen g3, is very strong. So knight g6 is not favoured by players of the black side. Also possible is knight f5, but then white can gain a move by bishop d3, threatening to exchange on f5 and take the pawn on g7. An interesting possibility is 7 castles kingside for black, when bishop h6 allows either knight f5 or knight g6, but bishop g5 is a strong move for white, threatening bishop f6. So c takes d4 is the move recommended by theory. Now on move 8, white has 2 possibilities. He can plunge in straight away with queen takes g7, or he can simply recapture on d4, c takes d4. In this second match game, Spassky chose 8 queen takes g7. The alternative 8 c takes d4 will be examined in the next game. After 8 queen takes g7, black has only one reasonable move, rook g8. Now white plays 9 queen takes h7. Now white has a material advantage, and he has a powerful passed pawn on the h-file. But black has a lot of strong compensation, because white is badly behind in development, and his queen side is very weak. Now Korchnoi chose the move 9 queen c7. The move 9 queen c7 threatens both queen takes c3 check and queen takes e5 check, so white must defend against both of these threats, and his only moves are knight e2 and king d1. Spassky chose 10 knight e2. Now Korchnoi played 10 knight bc6. This is the best move here. Black does not want to take on c3 immediately. He wants to play knight takes e5. Notice now that after 10 knight bc6, white cannot simply recapture on d4, 11 c takes d4, because of the reply knight takes d4, and white cannot recapture because of queen c3 check. So after knight bc6, black is threatening knight takes e5, and this will give him a very strong position. So white plays 11 f4. Now we can see white's problems in this position. Although he is material up, it is very difficult for him to develop his pieces. Notice the fact that white's g-pawn is under pressure from black's king-rook, and this makes it very difficult for him to develop his king's bishop and king-rook. And notice by black delaying the move d takes c3, it is very difficult for white to develop his queen's bishop. So theory regards this line as very promising for black, even though he's behind on material and white has the two bishops. White's development is very difficult. After black bishop d7, white played the move 12 queen d3. This is a good move. The queen wasn't very well placed on h7. Also, queen d3 threatens simply to take the pawn on d4 now, since black has no knight takes d4. So it forces black to do something about this, and white will then be able to develop easier. So after 12 queen d3, Korchnoi played the forced move d takes c3. Now Spassky played 13 bishop e3. He could have taken on c3, 13 queen takes c3, but after the move knight f5, white
is dangerously behind in development. Also, after queen takes c3, black can simply play bishop d7, and white eventually will suffer from the fact that almost all of his pieces are still on their home squares. So Spassky takes the opportunity to develop a piece. 13 bishop e3. Now switch off the tape and see what you would play next as black. No. Korchnoi played the interesting move 13 d4. Did you see this move? This, in fact, was a theoretical novelty when it was played. Recommended moves were knight f5 and sometimes bishop d7. In fact, knight f5 being the most popular move. But obviously Spassky had probably prepared against this move, and Korchnoi decided to try something new. The idea of the move d4, sacrificing a pawn, is to gain the square d5 for the black king knight. Also, d4 opens up the diagonal from h1 to a8, and black can post his bishop very strongly on c6, bearing down on white's vulnerable g-pawn. Therefore, this sacrifice is very worthwhile for black, even though again he's going to be more material down. White has great difficulty developing his pieces. Now Spassky has an important choice. After knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, black can play knight f5 with a strong position. But after 14 bishop takes d4, it is not clear whether black has sufficient compensation for the lost material, and it's almost certain that Korchnoi's move 13 d4 was a psychological ploy, and Spassky was probably too worried about some prepared analysis. The normal move 13 knight f5 gives black a good game without taking any risks. From the position of diagram 9, after 13 d4, Spassky declined the pawn with 14 bishop f2. Korchnoi now castled queenside, 14 castles queenside, and now Spassky is able to take the pawn. 15 knight takes d4. Black recaptured, 15 knight takes d4. Now Spassky played 16 queen takes d4. And the difference in the position now, knight f5 is impossible because of queen takes a7. So Korchnoi now played b6, 16 b6. Now black is a pawn down, but white still has problems over developing his pieces. The g2 pawn is still very weak. But now Spassky played a good move, 17 bishop h4. Now this gets the bishop to a good square, a good diagonal. Notice that black now can't play knight f5 because of bishop takes d8 attacking the queen. So Korchnoi decided to play bishop b5, 17 bishop b5, discovering an attack on the white queen, and also threatening to swap off the white squared bishops, which will further weaken white's position. After bishop b5, Spassky played 18 queen e4. Korchnoi played 18 bishop takes f1. And now Spassky made a mistake. He played 19 rook takes f1. Here Spassky could have taken a draw with 19 queen a8 check, king d7, 20 castles queenside check, knight d5, 21 rook takes d5 check, e takes d5, 22 queen takes d5 check, king c8, 23 queen a8 check with a perpetual check. Return to diagram 10 after 18 bishop takes f1. Spassky played 19 rook takes f1. This is a mistake, as I've said. Now Korchnoi has the opportunity to block the white queen's diagonal with 19 rook d5. Now white is still a pawn up, but his king is very badly placed. He cannot castle queenside or kingside, and eventually black's pieces will break through to attack this queen. Now Korchnoi is threatening to play knight f5, so Spassky decides to exchange this knight before it does any damage. 20 bishop takes e7. Now Korchnoi recaptured, queen takes e7. And he's threatening to play queen h4 check, immediately winning back the pawn on h2. As Spassky played 21 rook f3. Now this attacks black's c-pawn, so he can't play queen h4 check because of g3 followed by rook takes c3 check. So Korchnoi first of all moved his king to avoid this possibility. King b8. Now Spassky made another mistake. He simply moved his king 22 king f1. His best chance was to prevent the check on h4 by 22 g3. After 22 g3, rook d2, rook takes c3. If black plays rook takes h2, white can castle queenside. So black must protect his rook on d2 by rook g d8 with a level position. But after king f1, Spassky's king is now subjected to a fierce attack with rook d2. Spassky now played 23 rook f2, defending the g-pawn, and Korchnoi simply maintained his rook on the 7th rank with 23 rook g d8. Now black can infiltrate by queen h4 or queen c5. Spassky played queen f3, protecting the rook on f2 and also threatening the c3 pawn. So Korchnoi exchanged, rook takes f2 check. Spassky played 25 king takes f2. Black played rook d2 check. And now Spassky advanced his king 26 king g3. The simple retreat king f1 allows black to play queen c5 with a big advantage to black. The white queen is always tied down to the square f2, and black will simply take off the c-pawn and then advance his own c-pawn. So king g3, 26 king g3. Now switch off and decide what move you would play as black here. When you've done so, switch off this tape
and go on to the next tape.
Winaver French, tape 2, side 1. Well, from diagram 11, which was the game Spassky against Korchnoi, after white's king g3, Korchnoi played queen to d8, which was a good move, because if he'd played the obvious rook takes c2, white would then have played queen to d3, and then queen takes c3. Now black's move, queen to d8, prevents white from taking the c3 pawn. In that case, black would go queen g8 check. There's also a threat of queen g8 check, because if white tried to interpose with queen g4, black would win the queen. He could play rook takes g2 check. So, to answer these threats, white played his queen from f3 to e4. Black once again made the move queen g8 check, and white moved king to h3. Queen h8 check, king g3, queen g7 check, king h3. Now these two checks have been made with intent. The queen is now off the back row, and black's next move was rook from d2 back to d8. And there's a threat of a lawnmower mate with rook to h8. So white had to make some freedom for his king, and he moved his pawn up to g4. Had he played his pawn to g3, then black could play queen h6 check, king g2, and then rook d2 check. So here white is trying to get his king to g3. After white's g4, black played rook h8 check. White king went to g3, and black played queen to h6. White brought his queen back to g2 to stop the threat on the h-pawn and on the h3 square, but black still managed to check. He played queen to h4 check, white king to f3. Now switch off your tape and decide how you're going to continue this attack for black. Black returned his rook to d8. It's now threatening to come once again in at d2. And you can see that the white pieces have got into worse positions than they were before. There's also a threat of black playing queen back to h7. White played queen g3, and black played his queen to e7 now. And here the queen is darting around the board. Queen is now threatening to go to b7 check, so black is using the whole board at long range just to harass the white king. So queen e7. White's best probably was now to play rook e1, and then if queen b7 check, he could have played rook e4. Then if black played rook d4, white could have at least have played queen e1. However, after rook e1, black still has an attack. Instead of going queen b7 check, he could have played queen takes a3, or maybe rook d2. Well, white didn't find the best defense, which was rook e2. Instead he went pawn to g5, obviously intending to get his king into g4. Black played here rook down to d2, which has a tremendous threat of queen b7 check, followed by rook g2, which is going to win the white queen. Now white made his run, moves his king out to g4, and the queen nonetheless came over to b7. once again the threat is rook g2, winning the queen. White played queen takes c3 here, and I'd like you to switch off here and try and work out black's concluding mating attack. Black played here rook g2 check. White king went to h3, and now simply rook f2 with a threat of rook f3 check. Now the white queen cannot move off the third rank because then the black queen would come in at f3. So instead Spassky had to play king g4. And now not the obvious check, queen g2 check, but instead black played queen e4. And here black has two fairly strong threats. Queen takes f4 check and also queen f5 check, apart from rook takes f4 check. So I think at this point Spassky threw in the towel and congratulated Korchnoi on a fine victory. If we think back on this fine game, we can see that Spassky missed quite a few chances. He could have played the move bishop d4 on move 14, and then black would have then needed to justify his sacrifice. And later on move 19, he could have taken the draw by perpetual check, instead of playing the immediate recapture rook takes f1. Despite the flaws, the game shows that black has strong possibilities in this line. And even though white is a pawn up, or sometimes two pawns up, black's counterplay is very good. So as a result, white doesn't play queen g4 that much against the Winaver. He treats the opening with rather more respect. Now let's return to diagram 1 and reset the pieces there, switch off if necessary. Now replace the knight back onto g1. We won't desert queen g4 yet, so put the queen on g4, and after black plays c takes d4, we're going to look at another game which was the 12th game, and here Spassky did better as far as results were concerned. He played the move c takes d4, that's instead of capturing on g7. Now black moved his queen to c7, and there's two threats here of queen c3 check and queen takes c2. And there's really only one defense to both these threats, and it's to play king to d1. This move has a very strange appearance, but the king is fairly safe here as long as the center stays closed as it is. And if black castles kingside, white himself will get a fairly good attack going. Now Korchnoi took up the challenge and he did castle kingside. He's not afraid of white trying bishop h6 here, because he can meet that quite easily by playing knight to g6 or knight to f5. White played here knight to f3, and his plan is simply to build up an attack with bishop d3, knight g5, maybe throwing in h4. Korchnoi immediately began his counter-attack with pawn to f6. Spassky played bishop to d3, clearly hoping to attack the h7 square, and Korchnoi blocked the line of the bishop by playing his knight to f5. Now here it wouldn't be good of white to part with the bishop. Bishop takes f5. His bishop is going to be useful as an attacking piece and also to defend the important c2 pawn. Now Korchnoi had a difficult decision to make. He's faced with this threat of g4. He decided to possibly sacrifice a piece in order to get his own attack going. So he played the move knight from b8 to c6. And white continued with his plan of playing pawn to g4. Now instead of moving the knight, Korchnoi played pawn takes on e5. Now it's going to be a bad move if Spassky takes on f5, because black will put his own pawn from e5 down to e4. Then after white moves knight g5, black will just play pawn to h6, and basically white will have to give his piece back and black will have the advantage. So after f takes e5, white played d takes e5, and once again black decided not to move the knight at f5. Instead he continued by playing knight from c6 takes e5. Now switch off and calculate the possibilities in this position. Now if white takes on f5, black will play knight takes d3, white plays pawn takes d3, then black comes in queen to c3, attacking the rook at a1. So the rook can move to a2, then black goes queen b3 check, rook to c2. And now black plays pawn to e5. The idea of this move is to quickly play bishop takes f5 and then move his rook to c8. And you can see in this position white is extremely weak on the white squares, and though he's got this extra piece, it's not that valuable. For example, if he plays knight g5 threatening mate, the black bishop whips out to f5, stops the mate, attacks the queen, attacks the d3 pawn. Right, so it's not surprising that Spassky decided not to take the piece. So if you'd like to go back to now diagram 13, switch off if you need to reset these pieces. So from diagram 13, after white played d takes e5 and black played knight takes e5, white now played knight takes e5, black played queen takes e5, at this point threatening the rook on a1, and well, here white could play pawn takes knight, queen takes rook, and then f takes e6, threatening the mate, and black could answer with h6. Then white could play rook e1. Well, this was a possible sacrifice. White's got quite a lot of pressure there in the position, but Spassky decided not to sacrifice material. He just retained his rook. He played rook to b1. At last black has to move his knight, and he did so by moving it to h6. Now white could have captured the knight with bishop takes h6, pawn takes h6, queen takes pawn. Then after black goes queen g7, offering the exchange of queens, he does beat off the white attack, and he's certainly no worse off, might even have the better position. So instead of capturing this knight, Spassky gained a tempo by playing rook to e1. Black moved his queen to c7, white played bishop takes h6, and black played pawn takes h6. So if you'd like to turn off your tapes and try and discover white's next move. The move white chose was pawn to g5. Very strong idea. And once again, it wasn't so good for white to take on h6 with the queen. Black would swing his own queen over to g7, defending. Now white has to keep the attack going because his king in the center is still pretty precarious, so what he must do is to attack the black king. Now the move pawn to g5 is an attempt to open up the g file so his rook can get going on that file against black's king. Korchnoi here probably should have played rook takes f2. Then if white plays g takes h6, Black could bring his queen into f4, threatening mate at d2, and that more or less forces white to swap the queens by queen to g3 check, which leads to an equal endgame. Well, instead of that, Korchnoi played a mistake here. He didn't make the blunder of playing pawn takes g5, which allows rook to g1. Instead, he played pawn to e5, which at first sight looks a very good move. It discovers an attack on the queen at h3, and of course it gets the pawn rolling down to e4 if possible. However, after e5, white's next move, queen to g3, was very strong, and that threatened g takes h6, and there's also threats of capturing with the rook on e5. Black had to play pawn to h5 here. That was to block that g-file. And white nonetheless came in, rook takes e5, starting now to attack on the black squares. Black went bishop g4 check, and that seals up the g-file for the time being. White king c1, and black queen went over to g7, adding a greater defense to the black king position. This position is still a minefield for both sides. If white snaffles that pawn on d5, black can play his rook from a8 to c8. He can also probably play his rook down to f3 in some positions. Now, Spassky decided to retain the initiative and played his queen from g3 over to e3. He's trying to swing it into a more centralized position. Korchnoi played his rook down to f3, and Spassky played queen to d4. Now there is a threat of rook takes d5, winning a pawn and also gaining a dominant central position. After white's queen d4, black played his rook over to d8, and that does defend the pawn for the time being. If white plays rook takes d5, black will play queen takes queen. So, in order to renew this threat of rook takes d5, white played his rook up to b4. Okay, now switch off and decide what you think's going on in this position. Well, despite the possibility of mutual attacks being unleashed, both sides are quite careful about the gain and loss of pawns, and Korchnoi played the move pawn to b6 here. This just reinforces his pawn at b6, and if he does lose his d5 pawn by rook takes d5, then after the mass swap of pieces in the center, black will be able to take the f2 pawn, and then possibly the h2 pawn, and then his pawn from h5 will trot down the board to queen. So at the moment, black seems to be holding white off. Spassky's next move was a good idea. He moved his bishop from d3 to e4. And Korchnoi replied to this by playing rook takes f2. Now here, of course, if the queen takes the rook, black's queen will take the white rook. Possibly in time trouble, Spassky played a rather peculiar move. He played pawn to h3. Now instead of that, he had a promising continuation. He could have played bishop takes d5 check. Then after king h8, white can play rook to e7. Again, this looks a staggering move, but it's really just in order to get the better endgame. Queen takes d4 happens, rook takes d4, and white's got an advantage here because black is very tied down along the second row. Right, if you'd like to go back to diagram 15. After white's pawn to h3, black played rook f1 check, and white played king to b2. Now, the best move here for black would have been rook d1. Obviously, if the queen takes the rook, black can play queen takes e5 check. This idea turns up quite often in this position. Now, after rook to d1, instead of taking the rook, white would have to move his bishop back to d3. Then black could move his bishop away. So back to diagram 15 again. After white played h3, rook f1 check, king b2, Korchnoi played bishop takes h3. Probably not the best move. White now did take on d5, bishop takes d5 check, king h8, queen c3. That gets his queen out of the pin from the rook on d8, and there's a threat on the bishop on h3. This threat Korchnoi ignored. He took his rook from f1 back to f8, which supports the other rook at d8. Of course, he's not afraid of white taking the bishop on h3. His own rook on e5, the white rook on e5 is hanging. So Spassky now moved his bishop from d5 back to b3, and the best move here for Korchnoi would have been rook down to f3, taking advantage of the fact that the bishop was no longer attacking that square. After rook to f3, black takes over the initiative. White has to take the rook, queen takes f3, black queen takes e5 check. And now the white king is more exposed than black's kings, so white has to play his queen to c3, queen takes c3 check, king takes c3, and the endgame is much better for black, because again he's got this annoying passed h-pawn. Well, let's reset some of those pieces. Put the black rook back on f8, the black queen on g7, the white king on b2, the white queen on c3, and the white rook on e5. Well, Korchnoi missed this move. Instead he played bishop f5, and white moved his rook over to f4, attacking the bishop. Korchnoi counterattacked by playing rook c8 on the white queen. Now Spassky played a rather odd-looking move here, which was bishop to c4. He could have played queen d4, but he must have considered his queen would be looser on the d4 square. So he puts himself into this self-pin, and at the moment black can't take advantage of it. He can't play rook takes c4 because white would recapture with his rook coming over from f4. Well, Korchnoi, his bishop is now attacked on f5, so he moves it back to g6. And Spassky's next move was very strong. Rook moved into f6, sealing up the position. If black tries to win a pawn now, by rook takes f6, pawn takes f6, queen takes f6, you can quite easily see he'll lose his queen, because white will play rook e8 check, and then queen takes queen. So Korchnoi had to play a defensive move here. He went rook from f8 to e8. He was, by the way, threatened by the white rook coming down to e7, and then if queen took that rook, rook takes f8 double checkmate. So rook f8 to e8 parries that threat. White moves his rook over to d5, still keeping his little threat on of crashing in on d7, and black now played rook to c7, stopping that threat. White played queen to d4, and here black made a mistake. He played pawn to h4, which did allow Spassky to find a crushing move. So unfortunately Spassky didn't find it, but you might like to switch off here and see if you can. Well, in this position, white could have played rook down to d8. And that would have been threatening, of course. Rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, and then rook f8, which is mate because of the queen being pinned. Now, after white plays rook to d8, the only defense for black is to play rook down to c8. And then white can go back and put his rook on d7, which is what he's been trying to do for so long. Well, white missed this possibility. He didn't play his rook down to d8. Instead, he played his bishop back to b3. Sort of waiting move. Black played pawn to h3. And now Spassky played his queen over to h4. And at this point, and it's move 38, Korchnoi lost on time. Well, surprisingly enough, he had a winning position here. He could have played his bishop down to f7, except he'd lost on time. Then after white goes rook d2, black can go bishop takes b3. White goes pawn takes b3, and then black can play rook to c5, which will win the pawn at g5, and this will give him a very strong position. Well, maybe not a winning position, but certainly a strong one. Oh, this was an amazingly sharp game, and once again, full credit for both sides for the imaginative way in which they played it. And this shows the sort of thing you can expect from the Winaver. So if you like these sorts of games, for white or for black, then why not choose this line? Well, having discussed the main lines of the Winaver, we'll now look at some of the more unusual variations which white can employ. Often they're not as innocuous as they seem, and white often plays these sorts of lines just in order to avoid the main variations. Now let's look at the first idea, which is e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5. And now white plays bishop d2, a move favoured by Alekhine. And the ideas of this are quite simple. The plan is to swap the black squared bishops off, and that is to swap the bishop against the bishop, rather than as in the normal Winaver where you get the black bishop swapped against the white knight. Now if white can trade bishop for bishop, he'll make black weak on the dark squares, and also he'll avoid the doubled pawns that he gets in the Winaver. Now let's see how this can occur. Supposing black plays pawn takes d4, which is probably a positional mistake. After pawn takes d4, white will go knight to b5. Now if black captures on d2, white can recapture with the queen, and later the white knight will either sink itself on d6 with check, or it can recapture at d4. Well, as the knight will go to d6 with check, it's probably going to be a good idea for white to do that, though as you'll see in later games, white does have to be a bit careful about when he puts that knight in onto the d6 square. Now black can actually try to thwart this plan. Instead of taking on d2 check with his bishop, he can move his bishop back to c5, and this guards his pawn at d4. White can then play pawn to b4, and if the black bishop goes back to e7, white will later recapture at d4. So if black wants to hold on to his pawn at d4, he plays bishop to b6. And now white can come in knight to d6 check. Well, black has no need to allow the white knight into d6 with check like that. So let's return to the position where white has just played his bishop to d2 after black's pawn to c5. So instead of c takes d4, black's best move is to play his knight from g8 to e7. This ensures that when the knight comes to b5, black will be able to castle, and the white knight won't get into d6 with check. This makes a big difference. We'll look at the game Janosevic against Marovic, played in Versace 1977. Now, after knight e7, white played his knight to b5, so he at least establishes part of his plan, which is to swap the bishops. Knight b5, black played bishop takes d2 check, white played queen takes d2, and black castled. Now this position is very similar to the classical lines of the French defense, where black plays the move knight to f6 on move 3 instead of bishop b4, which is the Winaver variation. Now it's necessary to understand positions like this if you want to play the French in general, because the black strategy is often the same. He tries to undermine the white centre with moves like c5 and f6, tries to liquidate the white e-pawn, and he tries to take over the centre himself. And this is what black does in this game as well. Now I suggest you try and decide what you play as white in this position, and then turn over to side 2 to hear the rest of the talk. Winaver variation, tape 2, side 2. Now, in this position in the bishop d2 variation of the Winaver, we were deciding what white should play in this position. In the actual game, he played his pawn from f2 to f4 to support his centre, though I think probably pawn takes on c5 was the best bet, because then his knight could probably go back to c3 or d4 without having to suffer further harassment. Well, the move played was f4, and now black played pawn to a6, which does ask the knight, where is it going to go? Is it forward or backward? Now if it goes back to c3, black can take on d4, and after white recaptures with the queen, black will be able to put his knight to c6 and gain a tempo on the white queen. On the other hand, if the knight goes back to a3, black will be able to take on d4. White can now play knight f3, attempting to recapture the pawn at d4. But unfortunately for him, this way of playing, the idea is good, but he doesn't have as much time as he has in other variations, and his knight on a3 now isn't able to quickly get back to guard the d4 square. So black would play something like knight to c6, and then after white captures on d4, black will capture with his knight and once again gain a tempo on the white queen by playing, say, knight to f5 or knight to c6. So white didn't relish the move knight to a3, he didn't like knight c3, so he had to bring his knight into d6, where of course it looks very powerful, but this is something of an illusion. What will eventually happen to the knight will be that it gets undermined, and it may have to swap itself for the bishop at c8, which of course is black's bad bishop, and that will also help black's development. And the whole maneuver transferring his knight to c8, of course, only leads to a loss of time. Right, after knight d6, black played c takes d4, continuing his plan of demolishing the white center. White played knight to f3, attempting to recover the pawn, and black played knight b8 to c6. White moved bishop to d3. Now, White's plan is to start a kingside attack, and with his knight on d6, and he has several pieces in action, he has got some chances of doing this. We could look at the alternative to bishop d3, so put that bishop back on f1. Play instead white castling queenside. Here black will play pawn to f6, undermining the knight. Knight takes on c8, rook takes on c8, pawn takes on f6, rook takes on f6. And now if white attempts to recover his pawn by knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, black has got queen to c7 here. And that move not only threatens mate at c2, but it also threatens the weak pawn at f4. Now let's return to diagram 16. Switch off if necessary to reset the pieces. White played bishop to d3, and black played the move pawn to f6. Now the plan with black's move f6 is to play pawn takes on e5, white pawn takes on e5, and then black would play knight takes e5. And though at first sight he's losing a piece, because white plays knight takes e5, black then captures the knight at d6. This is what I meant by saying that the knight at d6 gets undermined by this little combination. So in order to avoid this happening, white may have to swap off on c8. However, Janošević is not the sort of player who will be satisfied with such a continuation. So he went into a more complicated line by playing castles kingside. Marovic here played pawn takes on e5, and in doing so he had to calculate the possibilities of white's Greek gift sacrifice bishop takes h7 check. So if you'd like to do this too, work it out about 10 moves ahead, then please turn off the tape here. The variation goes bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, knight g5 check, king to g8. Now white plays queen to e2, the only way to transfer the queen onto the h5 square. And as you can see, the white knight at d6 is doing a useful job by stopping the black queen from getting to the e8 square. Now black meets the white attack by playing pawn takes on f4, white queen to h5, threatening mate at h7. Black rook to f6, white queen h7 check, black king to f8, white queen to h8 check. Well, it's not mate because black can go knight to g8, and white now plays knight to h7 check. Black king goes to e7, threatening to take the knight at d6. So white must now play knight takes c8 check. Black rook takes c8. White queen takes g7 check. And black goes king to d6. And with his massive pawns around the center, the black king is actually quite well protected. White regains some material with knight takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, black knight takes f6, and white now gets another pawn back, plays rook takes f4, but after the black move knight to e4, you may like to look at this position for a bit. Well, white's got a rook for two knights. He has got two passed pawns on the king's side, but they're a long way from the queening square, and black's massively centralized position is going to give him actually a fairly easy win. He's got a threat of playing knight to b4 and then picking up the c2 pawn, and then of course his d3 pawn will be almost unstoppable. If white plays a3 here, then probably knight to e5 is good, and if white tries rook c1, then there's a nice fork by knight to d3, or even pawn to d3 is quite good. So white's position is hopeless. Right, so after the players had worked that one out, they decided to reject this particular variation, at least Janošović did. Now let's return to diagram 17, and we'll see what white did instead of making the sacrifice. So back to diagram 17. White doesn't sacrifice his h7. Instead he played f takes e5. And now black played sacrifice of his own. He played rook takes f3. White rook takes f3. Black knight takes e5. White is in trouble here. His rook's attacked at f3, and his knight at d6 is attacked. Still, he's not out of tricks. He managed to play rook to h3 here, threatening the pawn at h7, and black did capture the hapless knight at d6. White here played bishop takes h7 check, king must go to f8, and rook came into f1 check. So this looks like a fairly strong attack for white. At least all his pieces, those that he has left, are in action. The black king went to e8, and white queen has come now to g5. White queen to g5. Now, though black's losing the pawn at g7, this isn't his main worry, so what he does is just to continue to rush to the queen side with his king, because there he has a lot of pieces which will give him protection. So he went king to d8, white queen took on g7, and black king went to c7. This position is now pretty good for black, probably winning. The white can't do much against black's threat of playing bishop to d7 and then bringing his rook into action, and his king will go onto the queen side. So white attempted to open the position by playing pawn to c3, and here black should have played pawn to d3 just to keep the c-file closed. Instead he played an extremely risky move which almost landed him in some trouble. He played pawn takes c3, and this allowed the white attack to burst into flames once more. White played rook takes c3 check. Black king went to b6. It was also possible to go to b8. Anyway, king went to b6. Now white played an interesting shot. He went rook down to f7. And what do you think will happen if black takes this rook? Well, from the position of diagram 18, if black plays knight takes rook, white will play queen to d4 check. Black king goes to a5. Now, an accurate check here, rook to c5 check, and the black king has to go into trouble. He plays king back to b6, and now rook takes c8, discovered check, and black's game is demolished. Well, back to diagram 18. Turn off if you need to reset those pieces. Now after white's rook f7, black didn't capture. Instead he moved his knight from e7 to c6. White went rook to b3 check, and the black king is unable to go to a7 because of course he gets mated by rook takes b7 check, so he has to come out to a5. At this point white should have continued checking with his rook, which would have got him possibly a draw by perpetual check, because as we've seen the black king can't get back to a7. Now possibly black could escape if he gets his king onto the c5 square. However, instead of checking with the rook, white played a weak move here. He played his rook back to f2. This was intended to stop a check by the black queen onto c5. So rook f2 was played, and now black was able to consolidate. He played pawn to b5. White played pawn to h4, tempting to queen his pawn. It will take him a little while. Rook a7, queen g8, rook c7. Right, everything is now in order. All the black pieces are in play. He has once again got this beautifully centralized position, which occurs in the French if you manage to take off all the white pawns. And the game finished with white playing pawn to h5, black queen e7, threatening the bishop. Bishop went back to d3, black queen came into h4. Bishop went back to e2, black knight came to d4. White rook went to c3 to block the c line. Black played rook takes c3, white pawn takes c3, black knight took on e2 check. White played rook takes e2, and now black played the winning move, which was knight to g4, and here white had to resign. Now if you'll reset your pieces in the start position, we'll look at one of white's most popular continuations on the fourth move. And this is a continuation which is becoming more and more prominent as time passes. It goes e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, and the white knight goes from g1 to e2. The idea of this move is to avoid the double pawns on c3. Now, if black here plays pawn takes e4, which in fact he did in this game, the game we're going to look at is Lodeman against Serowan. White now plays pawn to a3. Here black can try and win a pawn. He can play bishop takes c3 check, knight takes c3, and now black of course could play pawn to f5, though in that case white has a good gambit by playing pawn to f3. I'll put that f pawn back to f7. Instead of playing pawn to f5, black can also play knight to c6. That counterattacks against the white pawn at d4. White then plays bishop to b5. Black's g knight goes to e7. And now white can either go bishop g5 or try to play in gambit fashion with bishop e3 and then pawn to f3. And these give white fairly good chances. Now let's return those pieces to where they were. White bishop from b5 goes back to f1. Black's knights go back to their original squares. And the black bishop goes back to b4. And we have a knight on e2. So after pawn to a3, 1 didn't swap his bishop for the knight. He played his bishop back to e7. And white recovered his pawn with knight takes e4. Now you might expect black to play knight f6 here, but instead he played knight to c6. If he'd have played knight to f6, white could then play the knight from e2 to g3. Now by playing knight to c6, white hopes to tie the white knight down at e2. So knight to c6, threatening the pawn at d4. White's next move was a slight mistake, and 1 pounced upon this immediately. He should have played queen to d3, as in the game, followed by bishop to f4 and castling queenside, and this is quite good for white. But instead he played the move g3, and 1 immediately took advantage of this. Black played here pawn to e5. Of course, if white now takes the pawn on e5, black will swap the queens, then capture with his knight on e5, and the white f3 square is very weak. However, why not just play pawn to d5, and this was the move white actually played in the game. Now switch off and choose your answer for black. After white pawn to d5, black played bishop to g4. This allows white to take on c6, but then black would swap the queens and play his bishop into f3, forking the knight at e4 and the rook at h1. And white would be unable to capture at b7 with any success, because black would just play rook d8 check and then take the rook at h1. So if you looked at that line, return now to diagram 19, and instead of taking on c6, white played his queen to d3. This guards the weak f3 square. Now, however, black was able to bring his knight into an active position instead of retreating it. So he played bishop takes e2, white bishop took on e2, black knight went into d4. This has the threat of queen takes d5, so white defended that pawn by playing pawn to c4. Black played pawn to f5, threatening the knight at c3. Sorry, the knight at e4. The knight now moved back to c3. And black's next move again was a good one. Instead of playing an automatic, say, knight f6 and castles, instead he chose to play bishop to f6. The idea of this will be to play his pawn to e4 at some point, and then his knight at d4 can't be captured by the queen. Also, bishop to f6 of course reinforces the position of that knight at d4. white now played bishop to e3, and black continued with his central policy by playing pawn to c5. Now, if white doesn't capture 1%, that knight at d4 will be tremendously powerful. I mean, if white ever takes it with the bishop, black will capture with the c pawn, and then he'll have a really strong pawn roller. So, white did capture. Pawn takes pawn en passant. Black recaptured. B takes c6, and white played rook to d1. Black now began his development again. After having established this wonderful center position, he played knight to e7. That incidentally guards his pawn at f5 in case white has his eyes on it. White played bishop takes d4, getting rid of that knight. Pawn took on d4, and the white knight went back to b1. Black now played rook b8, another sharp move. Rook went to d2 to guard the b pawn. Black castled, and white castled. Now switch off and choose your next move for black. Black's next move was very interesting. I wonder if you discovered it. It was to play his queen to c8. It's not all that obvious what he's going to do, but he's trying to play his pawn down to f4 and then possibly get his queen in to h3. He also wants to try and move his knight from e7, maybe around to the e5 square. And in order to do that, he's guarding his pawn at f5. Well, after queen to c8, white's next move was not too successful. He played his pawn up to f4, and that's probably as serious a mistake as his earlier g3. White hasn't been very successful with his pawn moves in this game. This pawn f4 move, the main disadvantage is the weakness it creates along the e file, particularly the e3 square. And Sowan was quick to spot that defect, and he immediately put his rook onto e8. White played rook e1, which was also actually a mistake, because he now gets into a self-pin. Black knight went to g6. White played his rook to c2. This makes way for his queen to scarper. Black played rook e3, and the queen went back to d2. Black now put more pressure on the position by playing queen e6. And the rook on c2 went back to c1, trying to break this pin. But black increased the pressure by playing rook b8 to e8. White played his king to f2. Right, well, you've got a crushing position, so how would you crush white in this game? Switch off and decide your move. Black's choice was to play knight takes f4, and at this moment white resigned, because if he plays pawn takes f4, bishop to h4 check, followed by bishop takes e1, and white's game is completely destroyed. Well, this was a very nice game, and it shows that black should be able to equalize against the knight to e2 move. Though white, of course, in the game didn't choose the strongest continuation on move 7. Should have tried queen to d3 instead of pawn to g3. Another line that white occasionally tries on the fourth move though not so successfully, is to play pawn to a3. So if you set up that position, starting e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, and now white can play pawn to a3. Bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now black plays pawn takes e4. Well, it's true that white can regain his pawn here, but it does take him so much time that it's really not worth it. He plays queen to g4, black plays knight f6, white queen takes g7, black rook to g8, white queen to h6. And though white has got two bishops in this position, they don't seem to be that useful to him. Black's center control and his pawn at e4 are quite strong enough compensation. Now in this position black does have several moves he can play. He can play c5, he can play b6, or he can play knight from b8 to d7. This was the move chosen in Fischer against Kovacevic, played in 1970. And this looks quite a logical move because it supports the knight at f6, which might get pinned by bishop g5 later. This game went after knight to d7. White played knight e2. Black now played b6, just developing his queen side. White played bishop g5. Black played queen e7. Here he's of course clearing his back row. White queen to h4, black bishop to b7. And now white played knight to g3. Of course, if black now castles, he might run into trouble after knight h5. So instead of that, black played a new idea. He played pawn to h6. And this move upsets the white apple cart. If white plays bishop takes h6, rook to g4, even rook h8, quite nasty. Followed of course by castling queenside. And if he takes with the queen, well, black could play knight to g4, and then if bishop takes e7, knight takes h6. Or he might also play castling queenside followed by rook g6. Well, Kovacevic won this game with little help from his friends, and the variation hasn't been seen much since.